Coming to you from the Windy City. Welcome to Let's Talk Shop, a podcast about all things cloud and enterprise tech. Listen to insights and guest interviews with IT thought leaders and professionals. Now, here's your host, Elias Kanaser.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Let's Talk Shop. I've been on a streak of former Gartner analysts and friends. I promise it's going to end soon. I've got a couple of really interesting shows coming up. But today is also a very special one. It's from a dear friend, a former Gartner colleague. David Mahdi, it's been a long time, my friend. How are you?
Eli, I am doing very well, and it is finally a pleasure to get on your show here. So thank you so much for having me and all that you've been doing for the community and others. And I'll say on behalf of Gartner alums, we love what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for making time. You were at Gartner for a while, kind of like me, and I've asked this question to all of my former Gartner colleagues that have come on the show. So I'm not going to spare you. I'm going to ask you the same question.
Okay. Yeah, go for it.
So Gartner's a great company. Why'd you leave?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I could probably take more time than the entire interview. But no, I mean it was I was there just over 6 years. Like by far one of the most favorite jobs, careers I've ever had, just because, I mean, and others that have gone through analyst life, whether it's Forrester or Gartner, but obviously we're talking about Gartner here today, it's such a unique job. And I think, Eli, the other part of it too is just, there's several thousand other analysts like you doing the same job. And even though you might have different coverage areas, you were covering a lot of cloud stuff. I was covering cybersecurity and identity topics. You and I would look at each other, we're tired, we're at an event, but we didn't even have to talk all that much. We just knew we were on the same wavelength. Right. So just the community inside Gartner and even outside with the alumni is just amazing. But why did I leave? It was a very tough decision because I still love it to this day, the organization and all the people there and the research they put out. But for me, it was 6.5 years, and I wanted to try something different. Now, timing wise, we had COVID, right? And we were going through that. I have a young family. My wife has a demanding job. She was one of the COVID responders. So it was really, really rough on us. And like many others that are out there, similar story, I just thought about my life and what I wanted to do and where I wanted to be. And while I was happy at Gartner, I thought, what? It might be time for me to just explore outside, to learn, to try some other things. There's a lot of advice and guidance I gave clients, but let me take some of this and put it into action for me, getting involved with M&A, raising capital, overall strategy, and continuing to help CISOs and their teams. So I left to just kind of try something new, to be adventurous, to realize life is too short. And, I want to try something different.
That's a great answer. I mean, that's essentially, you reflected my feelings as well. And all of the folks that I talked to kind of said the same thing. First off, a huge thank you on behalf of everyone to your wife for being a first responder. So make sure you let her know we're all very much appreciative of everything she's done. But now you're not at Gartner anymore. So where are you? What have you been up to? I mean, again, you mentioned that you focused on cybersecurity and identity. So I'm assuming you're in the same space. Where are you? Which company? What are you doing? What are you up to?
So it's been, as you know, Eli, and many other analyst alums, that's a busy job. And when I left, there's like this huge vacuum that you fill with things. Now, I'm obviously busy with my family life, but with jobs and my professional life, I jumped right in. I didn't miss a beat. I just jumped in. So I had a stint at a company called Sectigo where, I was there focused on kind of digital trust, cryptography, PKI, and did a lot to kind of spearhead some product-led growth initiatives. But along with that, I sat on a number of advisory boards, post-quantum cryptography companies, identity, blockchain stuff, and a whole raft of things. and cybersecurity events, and then doing a lot of CISO advisory stuff as well. And all of it, the method to my madness there was making sure that things complemented each other, right? So if I was going to do one thing, it would be synergistic. I always mess up that word with something else, so that if I'm putting calories into one thing, it's going to benefit all the others. And somehow I was pulled in to write a book on cybersecurity sales, so that happened. We're working on some more titles there as well, so stay tuned for that. But so it's been busy. It's been a busy year since I left. But recently, I just joined Transmit Security, and how that came to be was I know the founders really well. Covered them while I was at Gartner. Ant Allen and I nominated them, and they were selected to be a cool vendor for identity. Yeah. So it was back in 2019, 2020.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, and we always thought they were doing cool things. The founders have a very long track record of successful organizations like Imperva, Trusteer, and I've always been a fan of the team, and I thought this is a great opportunity. So I recently switched over, and effectively I'm a chief identity officer, going out there and spreading all the good news with really identity and cybersecurity. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, so what does the company do? So what does it focus on? What is the product? Like, how does it help organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Transmit Security, what really put them on my radar at Gartner was, first, they were like the true innovators in what's called identity orchestration. And the value proposition there is, if you think of like a modern bank has, calls, so they say multiple channels, right? A call center, a physical branch, mobile apps, websites. And many of these banks, they rolled these things out over time, right? To keep up with customer demands, competition, you name it. But there's a problem, because many of these were in individual silos. And if David or Eli goes to access your account, there could be multiple different solutions. Like there's one bank who will go unnamed, well over 400 identity solutions. Yeah, right. Covering all those.
Talk about sprawl.
Talk about sprawl, right? We could talk about cloud and having Azure and AWS and all these things and managing that. But imagine all of these. And some of these solutions, Eli, are quite old and legacy. So the conundrum there was, well, what do we do? Like, how do I get to knowing what Eli is actually doing across what they call the omni-channel, all the channels, if you will? And so Transmit came to market and said, let's do orchestration. Let's try to unite all these. We're not going to try and displace all of these products that are there, because some of them might still have to coexist for a while. Let's come up with a way where these identity leaders can get a singular view of an identity. So that's kind of where the genesis started. But the cool pairing was when they had this low code, no code interface, so that almost anyone with minimal training can come up, think about a user journey from when they get onboarded to if they go into the call center, into a branch, if they use a mobile app, if they have to reset their account, because that always happens. How is that life journey? And there's a way that these folks now, across all these channels, across all these disparate products, can use kind of a singular tool to get that singular view. But it's like these nice visual blocks rather than code and all this kind of stuff. So that's what put them on the radar for us. But since then, there's been an explosion of investment and identity companies. And I should say also Transmit Security did a very large $543 million Series A.
Oh.
Yeah, the largest Series A of any cybersecurity company in the industry. That was in, I think, July 2021, around that time frame. And I was still at Gartner when that happened, so kind of knew some of these things would happen. But anyway, long story short, where they are now today is they're taking that notion, they've really evolved it, and they're just solely focusing on consumer identity. So banks and airlines and retailers, all, like, we do all this stuff online now. Yet so many of the technology and solutions that are out there are focused on employees and workforce. And there's some good solutions out there for that stuff, but you can't really apply it to consumers. It's very, very different stuff. Anyway, I'll stop there. But in a nutshell, it's consumer identity, solving all these problems. And the last piece is we have to merge cybersecurity with that. And that's a part of why I joined in my role. So I'll stop there. It was long-winded,
So
but
when you say consumer identity, is this a B2C? So are the sales targeting the consumer, or is this a B2B offering?
it's a B2C offering. So
Okay.
we don't, Transmit's not selling direct to the consumer. We would sell to, say, a bank or an airline that runs, say, a digital storefront,
Okay.
or even physical, but it's backended by digital. And then they leverage Transmit Security's technology, which there's multiple solutions across that identity lifecycle. And they would deploy those to help with either authentication, password authentication, fraud detection, cyber threats on those channels, and all that. And again, that's where the contrast, Eli, is with others that are out there that just do workforce, because when you're a workforce, you sign an employee agreement. And so the company can say, Eli, today, in order for you to log in, you have to jump through hoops and wear a clown nose. Well, if the company wants you to do that, if they're not violating any local laws, you kind of have to do that. But with consumers, you can look at it and go, this stinks. I don't want to jump through a million hoops and wear a clown nose. I'm going to go to another service provider.
So I'm a cloud guy, and I'm a little fascinated with what you're saying. So how does this apply to clouds? AWS, Azure, Google. How does it apply to me as a cloud architect or an engineer? If I'm moving an organization to the cloud, how would your solution fit in?
Well, so it's cloud native, right? API driven, and then with the whole low code, no code, right? We give you the ability to do certain things, but also try to make it simplified, right? So you can contextualize, customize what you need, but also have the confidence that a lot of for example, we have a lot of threat researchers, and we're not going to expect you to have to get into the weeds of dealing with some of those, because we have a team doing that and arming our solutions with that. So it certainly supports kind of a modern hybrid multi-cloud environment. And again, when you look at the beginnings of the organization, almost, Eli, when you think about cloud posture management and all these types of things that anyone would do across that hybrid multi-cloud, orchestration is you have to get into that. And that's the amazing thing with Transmit, is that they were in orchestration before it was a thing. And I should say that not long after Transmit announced that, there were many other of the competitors of Transmit that copied that effectively. So it's good to see that happened in the industry. But going back to your core question, it's very complementary with these types of environments today. And in many ways, when I first looked at them, when they were kind of coming out of stealth, I was like, they are thinking further ahead, right? They were trying to solve the problems of today, but they were definitely thinking further ahead of where we are now with cloud migration and operations.
Yeah. So from your vantage point now, because you're now with a vendor, what are the types of concerns, questions that you're being asked from CISOs, from CIOs, from CXOs in general?
Yep.
Is it primarily around security because you're kind of in this realm, or are you getting security and a lot of identity? Obviously, you guys do a lot of identity, so I'm assuming there's a ton of questions. But what are some of the main challenges with identity? Is it the orchestration? Is it the integration? Is it kind of the single sign-on? What are some of these challenges that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, so first, I think what we should state, Eli, is the fact that there's identity's been around for a while, right? But it was one of those things that even if we go back and look at the evolution back in, say, the 90s, people would create applications, right? And then those applications would have their own identity store, because hey, log into this and I'll have a backend database that just will manage the users, and then the admin of that app can control what they can and can't do, right? All the users. But then over time, right, as organizations digitalize and they had more and more apps, it didn't make sense for every single app to have its own identity store. Again, the orchestration problem, right? So in a sense, we had things like Active Directory and all these other things,
etc.
Exactly, right? To say, I will create the identity once, and then they have their rights and entitlements, and then it can kind of go from there. So in a sense, Active Directory was like orchestration in those early days. But as we've gone on, we have cloud, we have mobile, we've got all kinds of different apps, and we have even things like IoT, right, with wearables, where you're not going to do like extensive passwords on a watch or in your car or all these things. And so what I think the markets realized long after that now, especially as we've gone to the cloud, identity is the perimeter. There's no firewalls. There's none of these like all this
I
stuff.
love that. That's a great quote. I'm going to steal from you. I will reference it back to you, but identity is the new perimeter. That makes
identity is the new perimeter. Exactly. And this was some of the stuff at Gartner. One of the last things I kind of touched on was, we have a good friend, Patrick Haveshi, which is looking at the cybersecurity mesh architecture. And a big part of that is this identity fabric. And even when you think of zero trust frameworks and all this, it's identity first security. Everything starts with identity.
Makes sense.
Right? And one of the reasons why I joined, and one of the mission I have, and for those of you who follow me on LinkedIn, I put a post which explained kind of my mission. And Eli, I met with something like 190-ish CISOs last year. And kind of continuing that, I meet with a lot of CISOs where we have these discussions, because you asked the question, like, what are they seeing? They all realize now the criticality of identity, because no matter if you're on-prem, you're in the cloud, you're a consumer, you're an employee, it all starts with who you are and what you do. And I'll further that, because it's not just humans. It's also applications need identity. And when we go to a cloud world, containers need identities, workloads need identities, right? I can go on and on and on, but now I'm not finding, when I have these sessions with CISOs, that I have to justify the existence of identity professionals. They get it.
They get it. Yep.
They get it, and they understand its criticality in so many different ways. And we're just scratching the surface, from even consumers, how it impacts them, employees, how it impacts them, contractors, gig workers, and citizens. We have the European Union, which has kind of released this framework for digital identities and identity wallets. So there's a lot of stuff there that we're just scratching the surface. Anyway, I'll stop there.
So you met with 190 CISOs. So you're telling me that it's clear, but I just want to reiterate. You're saying identity is the number one concern. But what within identity would you hone in on? What specifically? Like, for example, what are all those folks that have Active Directory on premises doing? Like, that's a challenge, right? So are they porting that into the cloud? Are they using something like an Azure Active Directory? Are they using Okta? Are they using your solution? Are they using all of the above?
So let me first just go back on that, right? Because just very quickly, when we talk about holistic concerns that CISOs have, and other security and identity leaders, one of the top ones was cyber insurance. Just like, if I get breached, what do we do? The other thing, and I ran a workshop about a month ago at a CyberX conference in Toronto, and it was closed to only practitioners, and it was like, how do you make sure you protect yourself as a security leader? Because if the company gets breached, you don't want to be liable, right? Like, you do your best to protect the company. Those, Eli, were like the top concerns. So not technology specific, but more on like, we need to reframe cybersecurity overall. So that was one. The other thing, and Gartner talks about this too, they said, 75% of CISOs have a consolidation strategy. And so that's because they have too many security products, too many identity products, right? And the last part of your question there, I'll tackle that in a moment, because there's just bloat when it comes to all the different products. And what's happening, Eli, is that, and I'm sure you see this on the overall cloud side as well. There's a problem of the day. Someone pops up and says, we need to buy this new product to solve that problem. But what happens is you get these security leaders that have cybersecurity analysts that work for them. And they say, Eli, okay, I know you're managing 13 products within our whole portfolio. You're going to have to manage 4 more next year.
Yeah.
You're not getting any more time, because we can't make more time. They might give you a little bit of a raise, but you're looking at that and going, so I have now like 16, 15 consoles I got to log into just to figure out what's happening here. It's bananas. So that was another concern. And that leads me into identity, because then they start talking about things like zero trust and all this. And when you really double click on it, zero trust starts with identity. Like when you say, I don't want to trust something, I get it. But at the same time, you have to build trust. You have to establish trust and maintain that trust with people you want to do business with or entities you want to do business with. I can't say, well, I'm never going to trust AWS. Well, if I never trusted AWS, I wouldn't put anything in there.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
right. So there's the paradox of zero trust and what it brings. But I say, when you double click on zero trust, it means establishing and maintaining trust, which you need digital identity. And so it's long-winded here, but I'll just get to your last part. So the current situation is very different right now with what I alluded to earlier on. When it comes to identity and security, we've got all these cybersecurity products that are, doing detection and response, doing scanning for malware and all this stuff. And then you have all these identity solutions, which, they all started just doing kind of governance and just managing the identities. They weren't really security companies. And having been the chair of the Gartner Identity Conference, when we looked at people who attended, there's some HR people that go to that.
I was gonna ask you about that because historically, what I've done when I was back in the corporate world, one of our biggest, sorry to cut you off, by the way, one of our biggest things was to tie in identity with the HR systems so that HR initiated the whole process, right? And HR terminated the whole process. So Eli joined new company, HR created the account, and then based on permissions, it populated all of the other applications that Eli needs access to. Eli leaves, one click, he's done.
Eli, that's excellent. HR, I just have to say really quick, I started in the world of defense and cybersecurity, and you get involved with all these, sometimes security people can be curmudgeons because, hey, we're trying to protect everybody and we're trying to make sure stuff doesn't go wrong. And usually when we are successful, it's not really celebrated. You just kind of live your life, right?
Right.
And so while I still enjoy cybersecurity and I've still been heavily involved for the last 2 decades, identity piqued my interest. And I got into identity by way of doing cryptography and PKI and doing national identity stuff and e-passports and all this stuff. And it really, really intrigued me. And then when I got more involved in, working with banks and retailers and all kinds of things, it was so interesting because you have all these different personas that rely on identity. So you have HR in the sense of, if you think, Eli, going back to Gartner, when Gartner hired you, they had to look at all your identity documents, right? From, whether it's US or your state or whatever, to know it's truly you. Maybe they did a credit check too. Some organizations do that. That's all a part of doing identity verification, proofing, validation, affirmation. And then once that's done, HR will then put a trigger to IT to say, create a digital identity for Eli now. Maybe it's an Active Directory with their identity system that provisions all the rights and entitlements you need so you have access to all of the resources, the digital resources, the research databases, all the applications you need access to. Because remember, as we said earlier in this conversation, rather than going to each app, HR can trigger IT and then IT can do that. You're called in that sense a joiner. Now, when you think about your life cycle, you might change jobs within Gartner to become a financial planner or a consultant within Gartner's consulting division. You haven't changed your name. You're still a valid employee, but you're not an analyst anymore. So we move you, you're a mover, and we change your rights and entitlements because maybe your access should change. And then there's a leaver. You and I both left within the last couple of years. We left the organization. They need to remove all that access to everything and all that. But when you think about that joiner, mover, leaver, it's not really security. It's security, but it's not security, right? But HR gets heavily involved in that. Well, now let's think about other personas. You have some customer experience people, marketing people that might own, mobile apps for banks, for retailers. Well, you got to log in. You got to access your account. They also want to see, are you doing any weird things? Are you like buying something in Singapore physically while you're in Chicago, Illinois? Like that doesn't work. All that's a part of you and your behavior and your identity. Right? So these marketers are looking at this stuff too, because they're thinking more about the experience and what it's like for you to log in. So identity is really big there for marketers and digital experience people. And then, of course, for cybersecurity people, they recognize and realize now zero trust, identity first security, all this stuff. Cybersecurity and identity need to come together. And I will say that we're moving in that direction, but we still have siloed cybersecurity vendors looking at stuff and saying all the threats use identity, but they're doing some rudimentary things. And then you see identity players that are still just focused on joiner, mover, lever, which is like, it's not really security. And you can't really bolt on identity to both of these sides. So what my mission is now today is we need to bring these worlds together. And actually, I should say, last thing, that was a part of why Gartner put me in the role that I was in. I was on the identity team, but I had a foot in the overall security and risk management team, so I could cover both.
So let me ask you something. So do you think that one of the ways that this will potentially come together is the market ripe for consolidation?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Because
So,
I mean, there's just a ton of cybersecurity and identity companies, and while there's a company like yours that's orchestrating, that presents its own sets of challenges. And maybe today, maybe on another podcast, we can talk about it.
yep.
But there's just so many of them. Is the market ready for a consolidation?
So I think it is. So let's first go back to what the customers are saying. The customers are saying, I have too many products, and 75% of them, per Gartner, they want to consolidate. So they already see huge silos within their operations, and so they want to.
So sorry to cut you off again, but
Yeah.
the sprawl is not just limited to security. Within IT in general, there's always been tool sprawl. And for the longest time, I mean, at least for the 26 years that I've been in this my career, consolidation has always been a goal. But I don't know if anyone's really achieved consolidation, right? I mean, you can consolidate 1 or 2, 10%, but there's always been sprawl. It feels like it's a difficult problem to tackle.
It is, and I don't think by any means we're gonna be done with solutions. I remember Peter Firstbrook a long time ago. We're going back maybe 15 years. He's one of our colleagues at Gartner. I think Microsoft did some big announcement about doing some security stuff, and all these reporters called Peter and said, "Is this the end of all these security vendors?" We had the CEO of RSA back in, I don't know, it was 2010, around then, give or take. He said at the RSA conference, in the next 3 years, there's only going to be 3 vendors in security. Well, look at where we're at now, right? It's this big kind of explosion of identity
Right.
and security vendors. So look, I think we go through these ebbs and flows. I always find now the cloud providers, because the operating systems of the world are now cloud operating systems effectively. I find that while we see major investments in security and identity from Microsoft, from Amazon, from Google, IBM, and other CSPs or cloud service providers in the world, we're creating more problems. And I'm not trying to reflect badly on them. Not at all. I mean, as we invent something new, there's unforeseeable problems. It was the whole Donald Rumsfeld thing. There's known unknowns and there's unknown unknowns, right? And as we continue down the path of cloud, I will predict that there are problems that will arise in the next 2 years that, Eli, you and I don't even know about now. So I think there's still always going to be a nice fruitful space for innovation. But back on the consolidation question, I mean, look, if you think about the Gartner hype cycle, all the stuff that's on the plateau of productivity, AKA products that are like repeatable, achievable, and they're just table stakes, those things I think are ripe for consolidation. Where and why I joined Transmit Security is, there's a lot of identity vendors out there. I know, because I used to work very closely with them. But they're differentiated in that they're like, we see cybersecurity, identity, focused just purely on consumers. These organizations that have massive consumer deployments and they do a lot of stuff, and citizens, that you can't just repurpose workforce stuff, because again, what I told you before, like the organization can ask you to jump through all these hoops. You can't ask consumers and citizens to do that. It has to be easy. So, there's the changing threat landscape, the changing demands, the changing environment. And I think there will be some success in some consolidation, but there's going to be even more challenges as we go through. And just to wrap all that up, I totally agree. I don't think, I think everything you've seen in your history and my history with all this, we're going to continue to struggle, but it'll be like ebbs and flows. And those,
Hey, it creates more work for us, so I'm not complaining right now.
it's true. But again, I just think in those hype cycles and maturity, I think those things that are far to the right in the plateau of productivity, those things are ripe for consolidation, frankly.
Time is quickly running out, and the conversation with you is super interesting. We're going to have to do a part 2, but I have to ask 2 more questions while I have you. What is your opinion? Do you have a position and opinion on cyber risk? I did a podcast with Google Cloud. I did a demo with Google Cloud on what they're doing with to enable cyber risk insurance in general. I was curious what your thoughts were on the adoption, on the feasibility, all of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, if we go back to some of those top concerns, and when I reflect on and Eli, now it's like year over year, it's well over a couple hundred CISOs and cybersecurity leaders that I've met with. It comes down to risk management at the end of the day. They know that they can't deploy everything possible because that's impossible, and they don't have enough people to run it, and they don't have enough resources, people, money, you name it. So they have to play the game of understanding risk. So any solutions out there that allow them to, technically get a notion of like, hey, all these things are exposed, right? Now I might look at that and go, for me and my organization, I don't have any regulatory drivers that make me do that. And frankly, when we do a risk assessment, it's not a risk that's going to affect us because maybe the jurisdiction we're in, the line of work we're in. So it does really come down to risk calculation. I don't want to get into COVID and all that stuff.
Yeah, of course.
It's loaded, but I'll just bring that up. Like, I have my wife who is like a life sciences professional. And then we have me who's like a cyber risk professional. And when we were going through all the COVID stuff from when it started to even where we are now, it was interesting to be a fly on the wall in our house because I'm looking at things of like pure risk. And I'm saying like, as soon as you step out of your house, you could slip and hit your head. Or as soon as you get in a car, you can get in a car accident. So you have to do these risk calculations, but you're like, what is the probability of that? So these risk professionals, it is ever more critical for them to start to think that way because they don't want to spend too much time overinvest in one area, and then they've left the back door open for attackers to come in. They have to think holistically, and they can't have perfect protection. They have to understand that resiliency is critical. It's I'll end off with this on that question anyway. It's like Rocky Balboa, right? It's not about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep on going.
Moving forward.
That's what you have to do with risk. Understand all the vectors, and as best as you can, protect yourself, adhere to regulatory drivers, and that's all you can do. And that's also why it's imperative for cyber professionals to make sure they've got good employment agreements so that they're protected, that it doesn't fall on them all the time. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I want to ask you about blockchain and a bunch of other things, but again, we're running short on time, so we're going to end it on a little bit of a lighter note. So I heard you collect a lot of NFTs because you see a lot of value in them. Now, NFTs I don't know what your thoughts are on them. Some people think they are valuable, some don't, but I want to tie this back to identity. I feel like if there's ever going to be a real use case for NFTs, it might be identity. And I'm curious what your take on it is. For example, COVID passports would have been a great example of how you could use NFTs. So what are your thoughts? Let's close with that one.
Yeah. So whether it's NFTs, whether it's digital wallets for identity, for payments, for all this, Eli, what all this comes down to is the concrete and steel foundation of all this is cryptography. Right. And we don't need to get all propeller head-like and get into the weeds. But frankly, the advent of these types of devices, all modern laptops, all computers have these chipsets, which are like these secure environments to create and store all this. So why am I bringing that up? Right. It sounds like it's coming out of left field based on your question. It's not. It means that we can now validate and lock in some of these digital artifacts. So whether they're identity documents, we could create those, lock them in, and bind it to you, and have a biometric unlock that, so you can actually access things. NFTs are another way of thinking about it. It's like in the case of what was very popular, like artwork, locking that in and then making it tied to an individual, so it can't necessarily be copied, or it would be obvious that it's not the original. Look, I think I'm a big fan of going back to look forward. And what do I mean by that? It was Frank Bundendijk. He did a future predictions course at Gartner, and I took that years ago in good old Stamford, Connecticut, in the HQ. And it was a part of these techniques of, if you're a futurist, like how do you actually look at the future? And so I was watching recently, I went back and I looked at CES from 2011 or 12. Okay. Why would I do that? Why would I be so crazy to do that? Everything is in the lens that we have now. Right. And so when we look at NFTs, a lot of people are like, oh, they're crazy, they're silly, And same thing with the metaverse. Look, our lives are going to be insanely digital 20 years from now. They will. And will the metaverse exist? I think so. But is it going to exist in the way that we are seeing it now?
Probably not.
Probably not. And going back to my example, CS, this was just before Apple announced the iPad, right? And at CES, all these vendors were getting the notion of it. And if you remember the Kindle, which still exists now with e-ink, and then, there were like tablets. And you know what? If you go back and watch it, you see vendors that were like, well, one side is e-ink and the other is like this PC. And they were calling it a portable PC, right? Or a tablet PC. That was the word. And so it was like all of these tablets were like, here, you're running Windows. And you're like, why would I want to hit the start button and go through all of file structure and all this? It's not conducive when you're touching and you don't have a keyboard. And then same thing, they're bolting on like all this e-ink. And so when I went through that, I'm like, that was a good example of before we had tablets, that was what we saw. And if we tried to predict what 2020 would look like back in 2010, those were the glasses we were looking through. We would say like, oh, there has to be a start button. There has to be a file structure that you can access and see the files. There has to be like 6 million ports on this thing.
That's right.
You know what I mean? So think about it today. I just want to kind of debunk the, people say it's crazy, and a lot of people are going through this trough of disillusionment right now, which is normal. I think it's appropriate, but we need to remember, I'm still jazzed about it because I think that this is foundational, and it's just those weird tablets, now today, but 10, 20 years from now, we're going to see a different version of it reborn in another way, but it's going to stem from some of that stuff.
I agree. And then we could do the same thing with cloud. I mean, cloud back in 2012 and 2013, 2011, it was a joke for most people. And then look where we are today.
Exactly.
The conversation with you is always interesting. You always have interesting perspectives. There's a ton more I want to cover. So you have to come back for a part 2 of this podcast.
100%.
But towards the end, I really, really want to thank you for making the time today to share all of these insights. And we'll see you again soon.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the followers, listeners, and definitely we'll jump at the opportunity to do part 2.
Take care now.